Okay, hi everybody. My name is Bramadat, and this is the last session of the day. Well, no, it's not quite the last session. It's the last session before dinner. So just you're gonna go get some dinner, get some calories and water in your body, so you can come back for the 7 o'clock event
online
and online, and Anna will give you some sense of what that looks like later. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the unceded lands and waterways on which Deakin does its business. I also want to acknowledge and respect the Coast Salish people on whose lands I work when I'm in Victoria, and on which I play and live as well. These communities continue to have relationships to that land on which UVic and my home are located. Today we have 2 more talks. The first one is by Melissa O'Shea, who's from Deakin University, who will be talking about yoga. So I'm very, very happy to be able to be chairing this session. And then Matteo di Placido and Stefania. Is Stefania with us, or just Matteo? Just Matteo, I think, which is fine. So first we'll go to Melissa, and then we'll 20 minutes, and we'll do back-to-back and conversation after. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you first, of course, to Anna for this very generous invitation. I do feel a bit like an imposter here in Interloper. I think there was a reference to psychologists being kind of right-wing extremists yesterday morning, which
Was it me? Was it you?
No.
No.
Wasn't me. No one in this room, but they were quoting. But it's a real pleasure, and it's more so been a pleasure, of course, to hear from you all. It's certainly a different lens for me, and I hope that the lens that I bring will be equally as useful to everyone, particularly given it's late in the afternoon, at least for those in the room. So thank you for staying. I'd also like to make some acknowledgements. I would like to acknowledge the teachers within the yoga tradition, of which I am a yoga teacher, Chiralai, Krishnamacharya, and his son, Sir, Jessica, and my teacher, who is also within that tradition, Jill Harris. I'd also like to make an acknowledgement of the country on which I work and live. The top picture there is of Heads, Wurrung country, and elders past, present and emerging for their care for country, and the beautiful location in which I live and the ongoing stewardship.
Mel, sorry to interrupt you, just the volume is not great, like in terms of microphone at the front, so if you could, just speak up a little bit, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, I'll have to give it a bit more. Yeah, thank you. And this is an image of Waipa work, colleagues of mine, and these are traditional movements, and also pay my respects to my colleagues there who really thought about the role of movement well before certainly I did. So I guess this talk really is around my yoga psychology journey, where I guess 2 worlds really came together for me, and I feel very privileged that I've been able to have that occur in my academic life, and certainly wasn't intentional, and perhaps some sort of serendipity allowed that to happen. I went to do my yoga teacher training. My background is obviously in clinical psychology. I did that because I'd had a yoga practice for many years and really wanted to deepen my understanding. And through that process, of course, identified many areas that resonated with me as a psychologist, and perhaps an approach that came to psychology in a different way. Obviously, this afternoon I don't have the time, nor am I an expert with regard to the history of yoga. Certainly, in part, George Bernstein is one particular scholar and text around this issue. Needless to say that yoga has many thousands of years of history, up to classical yoga and the Yoga Sutras, which was this first recording of yoga as a practice, and in fact really is the yoga of the mind before certainly Western psychology came to think about psychology and mind, and probably the tradition of which I've certainly schooled in is that sort of post-classical tradition, and we've talked much around how yoga and other practices are now represented. course, in my studies, and many of you will be familiar with this, is that, of course, whilst asana practice is part of yoga. In fact, for example, the Yoga Sutra is only 3 out of 196 aphorisms really around about asana or posture. In fact, yoga presents a system of living that includes, an ethical position. We talked yesterday around whether there needs to be sort of an ethical charter in complementary medicine, which of course yoga does. If we're talking about kind of social movements and whether or not spiritual contemplative practice has a place, again, these observances, the yamas and niyamas, I think do in fact speak to yoga as a practice in a fulsome way that also talks about how we are in the world before we sort of move into, pratyachara, where we're really thinking about internally moving inside and representing the mind, and hence my interest as a psychologist around this particular practice, and then of course the more contemplative and meditative kind of practices. In comparison, a lot of men, of course, in the history of Western psychology, notwithstanding that, really it's a much newer tradition. Really, we might really be able to go back possibly to the sort of 1700s, but really we're talking about a tradition that's much newer to considerations of mind and psychology. Coming from this tradition of psychology, certainly initially, what we know is that, and we've talked about it a little bit across these 2 days, is really there's this prominence of dualism, a separation of the mind as a sort of organising principle in psychology over this mind-body monoism, which is certainly more endemic to yoga and other contemplative practices. Leading on to that, as a psychologist and a practitioner, certainly I know that the sort of body is more or less absent also within kind of psychotherapy spaces, certainly within clinical psychology. Again, not the time to sort of go into where it might find itself, but it, largely very absent. But certainly as we've sort of moved into kind of post cognitive therapies, for example, mindfulness-based psychotherapies, we start to be able to think about possibly the body as being a sort of an anchor for mindfulness. Certainly, probably the work of Bessel van der Kolk is really where even psychologists started to think about, or maybe there's something here in the neuroscience of embodiment that might be important. And certainly more recently, you might even hear people who you might otherwise think very much come from a biomedical perspective will say, have you read The Body Keeps the Score? And starting to sort of come across and start to consider how the body might be important in considering well-being, and particularly, of course, in my field, in mental health. Interestingly, of course, and I'm actually a teacher of clinical psychology, so I'm also interested in the pedagogy around clinical psychology practice. Unfortunately, we also really see an absence of spirituality and in fact, religion in terms of really how we teach clinical psychology, which is, is another significant gap in terms of our training. So, why would I be interested in yoga, and how did this come to be, and how am I able to, come out as a psychologist who has an interest in yoga in a public space, in fact, in my own university campus? Well, the science is starting to come around to demonstrate that there are considerable benefits of yoga for mental health, anxiety, depression, trauma-based symptoms, sleep, and to a lesser extent, certainly eating disorders. And my work has been predominantly around anxiety and depression, but also around eating disorders. As a practitioner and as an observer of practitioners of yoga, I resonate with this lovely piece of work by Michaela Pascoe and colleagues that looked at what are the mechanisms really by which yoga might bring about these sorts of benefits for mental health. And they are the very constructs, I guess, of, that as a clinical psychologist and a trainer of clinical psychologists that we're really trying to target. So the concepts of self-compassion, mindfulness, reducing rumination, metacognition, our ability to be aware of our thoughts, and of course then to interact with in ways that supports them to be more helpful, and attention are those that yoga also potentially or does we think have an impact on. So, as a practitioner, as a scholar in yoga and as a scholar in clinical psychology, certainly felt to me there was potentially a place that I could play in kind of exploring how these two practices might come together, and hence the opportunity as an academic to sort of explore also as in research these practices. Certainly my own sort of personal lived experiences, it really has supported me having the body as an anchor for mindfulness. Probably unlike maybe sociologists, psychologists are highly sort of metacognitive and ruminative. And so it really has been a practice that allowed me to really be able to support a higher degree of dispositional mindfulness. And certainly what we know, those with mental health issues, but being able to engage in a mindfulness practice that is supported by the body may be more accessible. We're already leaning into mindfulness as an adjunct, other psychological practice. So what are the opportunities to think about yoga and a body-based mindfulness practice within psychological interventions? Already as clinical psychologists, we endorse exercise as sort of part of behavioural activation and feel comfortable to recommend it in clinical practice. There's something very important about embodiment and building a sense of embodiment or reconstructing embodiment in eating disorders and, of course, in trauma symptoms. Being able to integrate yoga as a contemplative practice within psychological practice allows us potentially to bring spirituality back into the psychotherapy room. Some beautiful work also around how, as clinical psychologists and other psychotherapists, that in fact engaging in yoga as practitioners ourselves really enhances the work that we do. And again, is my experience as an educator and as a clinician around those benefits, around being able to bring balance and calm, to be able to meditate, if you like, or be mindful of the student or the client in front of me. And of course, we also find that, as interestingly as psychologists, there is quite a high, engagement with and an endorsement of complementary approaches amongst us as our discipline. But what are the barriers and dare I say risks, maybe perceived risks that I guess I've faced as a practitioner and also those of my colleagues around being able to integrate yoga more into our practice. We do come from this sort of Western positivist epistemology. Certainly I don't hold this view, but there's certainly some members of our profession who really see that any kind of engagement with complementary medicine might really be a sort of rejection of scientific reasoning and an undermining of our profession. We're highly regulated as a profession. We're registered with AFRA. There are funding implications. How we fund it is highly regulated, also around what's considered appropriate to be funded. Not to the extent, the whole issue of touch within therapy and these broader ethical considerations. And there are attitudes of our peers around, what's appropriate and what isn't to bring into our practice. And I guess for me as a practitioner, really some hesitancy and uncertainty around how you might safely or ethically integrate yoga amongst other complementary modalities into clinical practice. What's allowable has been a real question for me. a little bit of work here that was recently published by Thomas Casey and colleagues. You know, we're grappling with this very question. Harry Thompson Casey is a nutritionist. I'm a psychologist, but was grappling with the same sorts of issues and explored, you know, where are the, you know, what guidelines are there for practitioners around how we can integrate these modalities within our practice. And in fact, there's really just no policy or clinical practice guideline within Australian regulatory bodies that really supports us in thinking about how we might bring yoga in as a mindfulness. In other words, when I was considering how to kind of bring these modalities together, and this is actually cited in that particular paper, you know, the only advice I can come to is it's allowable. I'm allowed to be, for example, a yoga teacher, and I'm allowed to be a psychologist, sort of, but never the twain shall meet. This advice is quite old now, in sort of 2008, and you know, really practices discrete. I have to sort of, you know, have two hats and live as sort of really, you know, not be able to integrate these aspects theoretically. So what have I done? Well, I guess if you know, you can't beat them, really, you know, join them. I've really thought about how I bring this sort of positive position to Eastern science. And really thought about how can we consider yoga as an adjunct treatment, bearing in mind I'm aware of this sort of professional hierarchy that I'm possibly reinforcing here, or sort of really try and promote holistic treatment models, yoga with psychological practice and vice versa. And I draw very much on recovery-based mental health care principles around choice and empowerment. Some of the work that I've done initially to really explore how has yoga and evidence-based psychological treatments come together, and there really is very little. And so I've undertaken a little bit of work with my colleagues around, you know, what is in fact the benefit if you have yoga as an adjunct, for example, the cognitive behaviour therapy, and indeed the results, you know, it was a mixed methods study. And what we see is that those that engage with yoga alongside CBT, really, they do better. And whilst it's not published as yet, it's under review, even at the 12 months, we're seeing some, you know, ongoing benefits to people who have engaged with yoga along with CBT in terms of their the benefits within anxiety and depression, which is really pleasing and really exciting as a practitioner. Talking about aesthetics. Where to next, I guess, in terms of the work that I'm hoping to do with my colleagues. I'm really sort of passionate about the development of some consensus guidelines, how we would in fact integrate yoga within clinical psychology practice. We're starting to look at an examination of sort of health professional views of lifestyle medicine within mental health, including yoga. Then to really unpack psychologists' views around risks and benefits before hopefully getting moving to a Delphi methodology. And of course, I'm an educator, and I'm also passionate about how we integrate more holistic models of psychology into curriculum. And next year, thinking, I guess, around really deepening my understanding by engaging perhaps in yoga therapy training, which I'm really excited about, and that no doubt will bring even, you know, new perspectives into how we might work into the future. So thank you. I hope I've been on time, and you know, I look forward to your questions at the end of this program and your ongoing collegiality and networks. And again, thank you, Anna, for including me.
Thanks, Melissa. So now we have Matteo, and is that Stefania with you? Yeah, okay. I'm not sure how you guys are going to divide up your time, but take it away.
Good morning, everybody. I have a PowerPoint presentation to share.
Sure. If you just start sharing, it'll probably automatically.
No, I need to be made, I think, co-host in order to be able to do that.
Give me 30 seconds.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Can you try now?
Okay, now it's I can do it. Let me know if you can see the slides.
It's launching. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
You can just make it, there you go.
Yeah. Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank you all for the invitation to this symposium and for the inclusion into the Spirituality and Wellbeing Research Network. Today, I'm also presenting on behalf of Professor Stefania Palmisano, who is unable to be with us due to another conference. She's connected, as you can see, but she cannot intervene and so on. Our talk today has the title, Crisis and Spirituality, how pragmatism may help us to conceptualize nurses' needs for and the limits of spiritual care in hospital settings. As we will see shortly, it is based on two projects that we have been carrying out at the University of Turin in the recent past. And in both of those projects, Professor Palmisano was the leading researcher, or the PI, as you say in English. So, a brief note on the structure of the presentation. First of all, we're gonna have a brief background overview before zooming into the aims and objectives, the theoretical frameworks that we suggest to apply to this specific area of study, and then we will zoom into the relationship between pragmatism and nursing, looking at nurses' narratives in the light of the wounded storytellers concept, if you like. Then we're gonna make a possible claim, if you like, of spiritual care as body work, and we will draw some preliminary conclusion. Let me state before we continue that this is very much a work in progress in terms of the theoretical application of these concepts to our empirical material. That is to say, we have not yet published anything or conducted in-depth analysis using this conceptualization. So any comments, especially critical ones, are very welcome to let us improve our argument. Okay, a few information about the background, if you like, of our talk. So it's important to underline that the intertwining of therapeutic and religious dimensions is one of the main features of contemporary spiritualities, of holistic environments, and also of psychotherapy, as we just saw, for example, in the last presentation. It is not surprising, therefore, that the recent years have witnessed an increasing legitimization in medical sciences, and nursing is a great example, or a more holistic view that also contemplates the spiritual aspect of a patient's experience. Again, we just saw how also psychology falls within the same discursive formation, if you like. The literature, and now I'm talking about nursing, primarily pertaining to the Anglo-Saxon context, arguments how spirituality represents a fundamental dimension of the health and well-being of the individual, and how it is capable of permeating and integrating all other dimensions of health. In more details, this literature discusses the many benefits and positive impact that responding to the spiritual needs of sufferers can have on their clinical and therapy process in terms of achieving states of well-being, increasing chances of healing, implementation of coping strategies, and a more participatory involvement in the clinical relationships. However, this literature, whose roots are in the study of the inclusion of spirituality in palliative care, tends to present a high historical and essentializing understanding of spiritualities, which is partly corrected only recently by sociological study on the subject matter. When it comes to COVID, nurses found themselves in the front line of health and social care in the most unprecedented circumstances, and have been particularly exposed to the increasing emotional stress, psychological risk, and mental health issues as well. These, we contend, justify the attempt to try to put forward some scheme, some theoretical framework to understand the scenario better. Final note regards the broader relationship between crisis and spirituality. As we know, in many religious and spiritual traditions across geographical, cultural, and religious contexts, crisis, whether social, existential, or health-related, is often represented as a turning point inward. Examples are multiple. Let us simply think about, for example, Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita facing his family members in the battlefield and receiving from Krishna the insight that the battle is a good thing. This is just an example, but examples are really a lot. So, as I briefly mentioned earlier, our talk is based on data gathering in these two projects: religion in the hospital, integrating spirituality and medicine, and from cure to care, digital competencies, and spiritual assistance in hospital healthcare. Brief view on these two projects. Well, please don't read. It's a lot of stuff. I don't like to make slides like this, but sometimes I do. What is important about it? We had to change the design of the project due to COVID and due to some conflict, if you like, or dialogical encounter, to put it more elegantly, with the ethical committee of the hospital, which didn't quite like the idea of a qualitative study. Okay, and of course, due to the COVID, we couldn't access the premises of the hospital as we envisioned, and we couldn't shadow nurses and patients. So instead, we relied on focus group, interview. We created a questionnaire that nurses delivered to patients, and so on and so forth. This talk is largely based on the nurses' interviews and focus group. The second project is indeed a pedagogical project, which aim to give some core competencies in the field of spiritual care and digital competencies to nursing students and generally to social science students. This project also had a specific part which was designed to carry out some research. It just finished. It was a joint effort between 5 universities, all European, and it was largely based on an online e-learning program with some face-to-face labs and a mobility in Turin, where we are located. If you want to know more about these projects, we can talk more about it later, or you can just get in contact with me or Professor Palmisano. Now let's go to the juice of our talk, which I think it's more interesting for everybody. So what is the aims of our presentation? Our aim is to introduce a pragmatist theoretical framework tailored to conceptualize nurses' needs for and the limits of spiritual care in hospital settings in the light of the recent pandemic. What do? We simply conceptualize COVID as a moment of crisis that fosters nurses' needs to creatively adapt to a new scenario, thus reshaping their habits that we have been divided in belief, experiences, practice, and professional repertoire. Also to the provision of spiritual care, whose needs and limits have become evident during the pandemic. In very simple terms, our theoretical framework is really based on Schilling's theorization of the body and his adoption of the pragmatist notion of habit. So these two specific areas, that is Schilling's theorizing on the body and the notion of habit, coupled with the specific attention to biographical and societal moments of crisis that simulate social actors' creativity and actions oriented to social change, we contend, may help to understand and explain innovation and social transformation. Another important aspect of this framework is that, according to Schilling, there is a substantial difference between the pragmatist notion of habit and the classical sociological concept of habitus. I raise my hands to say I don't agree. The problem, and I'm quoting Schilling, with habitus is that embodied action appears predetermined. It both echoes and replicates existing structures, leaving those who operationalize Bourdieu work in the research employing strategies to modify his reproductive logic. And according to Schilling, habits, it doesn't replicate this deterministic view, but pinpoints the lived and practical aspect of reiterated behavior and social action. As I just said, in my view, the concepts are rather overlapping and not so different. So what can we say about pragmatism and nursing? And please bear with me that these are preliminary reflections, okay? So I would like to start with the following question. What is the benefit of applying this framework, or better, the notion of habit, to the nursing profession, having, of course, in mind the field of spiritual care? And what can it be, the contribution of the notion of habit within Schilling theorization to the study of spirituality, well-being, and crisis? So let's try to be inclusive and give some food for thought also for those who not necessarily study nursing and spirituality. Okay, according to the empirical material at our disposal, which as I said, we are regarding their professional identity. In other words, beliefs are and crises are instrumental in their representation of the profession and the choices of becoming nurses. For instance, a few narratives from our informant testify to that. I'm just paraphrasing, I don't want to read the quote. So basically, one person told us that she decided to become a nurse after she had to bring her mother to the hospital for a very bad car accident, and she saw that the nurses that she interacted with, both male and females, both young and not so young anymore, were not quite caring, okay? So despair, crisis, unhappiness to see such a complex and delicate scenario. So she decided to become a nurse. Another person decides to become a nurse. This is a guy, because when he was younger, he was bullied, okay? He got beaten up badly. He ended up in hospital where he met a nurse, which becomes, in his own words, he says, luminescent figure or some kind of light for him, okay? So that gets him going. And another person that's quite interesting, because perhaps is very much typical of the Italian context, become a nurse after she heard a call. She heard a call from God to become a nun, okay? But then she had to somehow balance between family responsibilities, family duties, family pressure, and her call. And so she found out that nursing could be a good middle way. What are then nurses' experience of COVID? They can be summarized, in our view, in the following sentence extracted from our fieldwork. And here I'm reading from our informants. The serious problem of this situation, COVID, that you are experiencing, it's not right now, but it will be in a few years. The stress that we have been subjected to for all of us that work in the COVID wards will be seen in a few years, not now. Stress is moving inside of us. And when you are completely detached from the patients, all this fear of infection become real. We have all been thrown into this thing here, COVID, with the fear of being infected and the fear of getting sick. And when this virus thing will finally fade away, then we can breathe in some relief, but we will really see the effect. So basically, COVID has been challenging at the root the experience of being in the hospital for nurses. And according to the narrative, they're gonna pay the price for it in the future, not right now. The last aspect regards the relationship of COVID-19 and how it affected practices and professional repertoire. Okay, I'm not gonna read again, otherwise I'm fearing to, so to say, lose my time. But what emerged is that the main change that nurses had to face is that beside doing their usual job on the patients, although in very different circumstances, that is clothed in a specific way, with mask, with patients oftentimes on the verge of death, which is not necessarily the case for all patients that nurses interact with. They had to do so in an environment full of worries and to, at the same time, relate with the patients in a very different way, because the patients couldn't see their families, so they became really the reference point for the patients. They became somehow the main relationship where patients would voice and vent their fears, their worries, and somehow channel all that energy that isolation brought forward. Nurse is a wounded storyteller. Okay, as you know, this concept by Frank is actually coined, theorized to help us make sense of health and illness. Okay, so here we are adapting to the crisis moment of COVID in the hospital settings from nurses' perspective. The main narratives that Frank identifies are restitution narratives, cause narrative, and quest narratives. Okay, let me tell you, for the sake of brevity, that the first two narratives are not really present, although not completely absent in the nurses that we interacted with. But the third narrative, the quest narrative, which emphasizes the importance of crises, such as illnesses or, you know, a social crisis like COVID, so the importance of crisis to be transformed into a means for the ill person of the traumatized person to become somebody new. This is really something that nurses emphasize over and over again. In fact, according to our informants, this is the heart of the point. So we are facing such a context, but such a situation, but what we can do with this is try to become better nurses, better relatives, better parents, better at improving the practices that we have in the hospital. So there is this, if you like, forward-looking hope, thing that we do not have in the restitution narrative, or somehow a little bit, but not at all in the chaos narrative. So this is a point that is particularly there to me, although we would need more empirical evidences to substantiate it, and is, can we talk about spiritual care as body work? Okay, what is body work? Body work is paid work on the bodies of others, okay? What is then spiritual care? Spiritual care is the professional attention to the religious and spiritual needs that individuals express when they experience severe pathology, okay? It's not only that, because there are some interventions in hospital, such as the management of the dead body, for example, which can be done according to the faith and the beliefs of specific religions. So this is very much body work, although a body work on a dead body, sorry, I smile, there is nothing to smile in reality, but it's interesting, this kind of just exposition of body work on a dead body. Anyway, we would need more empirical evidences to really see if we can talk of body work. But I think the idea is promising because it is counterintuitive. When we think about spirituality or spiritual care, we often think about some mysterious inner self, interiority, belief in the transcendent. What about immanence? What about our body? What about relationship? I think this is very much in the domain of spirituality. Brief bracket, spirituality, for example, in the Greek philosophical tradition is very much philosophizing, right? This is just a bracket, and we find these reflections in some work of Foucault as well, for instance, on the practice of the self. So again, what's the difference about philosophy and spirituality? But here I'm going off track, so I keep quiet and move to the preliminary conclusion. Give me a second because I lost my script and I would like to not miss anything. So let me start mentioning a few lines of analysis that can shed light on what we discussed briefly so far. First, it is important to mention the overlaps that occur ontologically, epistemologically, and methodologically between pragmatism and lived religion and practice approach advocated by scholars such as Hammerman, for example. The core, according to pragmatism, as well as to these approaches, is in fact what happens in the social world through concrete social action. So I think this would be a promising line for future investigation. Similarly, the concept of health and salvation nexus emphasizes the same tension. That is, the manners in which the practical discursive universes of the cure and care of the body and of the soul are, in our society, progressively conflating. This, however, does not mean that, for instance, within a single institution, such as a hospital, there are not a plurality of interpretation of what spirituality is and how it should be or could be deployed. Now I'm going to the last note, where there is a little bit of risk, just to link to the actual third element of the symposium. So I would like to emphasize the critical role of sociology in different way. For example, the inclusion of spirituality in care setting must be understood in the light of broader historical, discursive, and practice processes that characterize its social construction and use within specific devices, whether religious, political, or therapeutic. Moreover, the task of sociology is, in addition to understanding, that of critical analysis. In sociology, if sociology shies away from critical analysis of the inclusion of spirituality in care context, it becomes complicit in an essentializing project which has often confessional overtones. The inclusion of spirituality in care context, in fact, runs the risk of being instrumentalized by neoliberal care policies focused on personal responsibility of the patient and of hospital staff, and flanked by the progressive corporization of care. For example, among the most widespread discursive and practical logic of the inclusion of spirituality in healthcare, we find its use to mitigate the high rate of burnout among physicians and nurses who are overburdened by workload and widespread staff shortage, as well as an emphasis on practice and intervention that focus on patients and health, giving professional accountability rather than systematic and structural intervention, okay? So this is a problem, this is a risk. Thus, we cannot avoid considering the risk that such processes may lead regarding spirituality as currently decline in care settings. So the risk is that he may assume, he may take the traits of a veritable technology of discipline that contributes to the creation of docile bodies, to quote Foucault. That is, individuals whose value and social role are first and foremost contextualized in relation to the economic imperatives of efficiency, productivity, and work performance, rather than the promotion of holistic, integrated, and transformative care. So I think that we can close here. I hope I was in time, and thank you so much for listening and for the opportunity of being here with you all.
Thanks, Matteo. That was great. You were really right on time, about maybe a minute more, but that was awesome. So